very stimulating. First, Madam Chair, I'd like to submit for the record an editorial we just published yesterday as regards the nexus, if you will, between exporting U.S. oil and actually reducing global CO2 equivalent emissions and reducing funding for terrorism.
We'll include that as part of the record.
In the article, we point out, for example, that I suspect Ms. Vakshuri could testify to this, is that the Iranian oil fields emit about 3 times the CO2 equivalents as U.S. Gulf of Mexico equivalents. And if they bring up their, we put $2 million, if Iran brings up their daily output by 2 million more barrels a day, they will emit 100,000 more metric tons of CO2 equivalents per day, 36.5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year than the U.S. does from our Gulf of Mexico. So if one of the concerns of our colleagues on the other side is CO2 emissions, it actually lowers global CO2 emissions by exporting U.S. oil. And let me credit my colleagues in the back, Ms. Guinevere Gorman and Mr. Jack Crampton, for their help in researching this editorial. That said, Mr. Crane, in your testimony, you speak that one thing we could do to help shut down, is that although ISIS is awash in cash, they do business with large enterprises, and at some point may attempt to move that cash into banks if they've not already done so. And you say Treasury could go after these entities as a way to increase transaction cost. Why haven't we already? I'm sitting here thinking we should have done this a year ago. So have we attempted and been unsuccessful, or has it been a pathway which we've not pursued?
My understanding is that they don't use banks much. The question really is there's a number, as you know, heavy trucks, Class 8 vehicles are expensive, cost over $100,000 a year. Some of them are operated by fleet operators. What I think would be useful is make sure that we have intelligence about which companies, some of which are located in surrounding countries or in Syria, are operating those vehicles, and you can then go after those. A lot of the trucks are operated by owner-operators, you know, that are sanctioned.
But you mentioned specifically some large companies that they must deal with. I'm sensing that you have a sense of which large companies those are. Have we gone after those large companies?
There are some in the KRI and Kurdish regional government area that have been accused of doing this. I do not know if we have actionable intelligence.
Gotcha. Mr. Webster, you emphasize that the U.S. shale production has contributed not only to U.S. but also global national security. It would do more so if we allowed oil exports. But I'm struck that we just assume that fracking industry can rise and fall effortlessly. But from the field, I'm hearing that because prices have remained low so long, that now that production capacity is not only being idled, but the workers dispersed. That we cannot necessarily ramp up within a week this fracking capacity, but rather be reassembled over a period of time, and the longer we go with it being disassembled and dispersed, the longer it would take to do so. Is that a correct assessment?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. Actually, that is correct. The longer that the fields that you kind of move out and lay off the crews, of course, the longer it takes to reassemble them, both in terms of the kit that is required, but also in terms of the personnel. So while you can bring production back up when there are market signals, the longer that they are not, you know, kind of at the high level of investment, the longer it does take.
So the more we dilly-dally, the more we run a risk of not being able to reassemble quickly, thereby hurting both national and global security.
The longer that the price is low and that you're not moving, absolutely.
Yeah, gotcha. Ms. Vakshuri, I apologize if I'm not getting your name correctly, but the Carnegie Institute for International Peace does point out that Iranian oil production emits 3 times the CO2 equivalents as U.S. oil production. But you mentioned that they would like to move to refinery capacity. Have the Iranians ever shown in their refinery business any particular concern for CO2 emissions?
Well, of course, I mean, I think, Senator, first, thanks for your question. I can't compare the efficiency and the emissions and the facilities in Iran and the United States, but yes, there are going to be of course, more emission, producing more emission than those in the United States. But I would like to mention something, and that's about Iran's export or Iran's crude oil, and that's the different type of crude oil in Iran and just the different markets and different types of refineries that are refining Iran.
Ms. Vakhturi, I'm sorry, I'm out of time, and I have one more statement to make. So can I ask you to hold that and submit that answer for the record? I apologize.
Sure. Just one more point. The additional refinery capacity would be for Iran's condensate, and condensate refinery would not be as
Emissive.
yes.
Let me just finish by saying this, Madam Chair. We heard from Ms. Yellen the other day that a decrease in U.S. oil production is now a drag on the economy. We hear from the Aspen Institute that if we allow export of oil, we would create 630,000 jobs per year and increase GDP by $141 billion. And we hear from Mr. Webster that by exporting oil, we will increase both national and global security, but if we don't tend to it, we will lose that opportunity. Both on an economic, a national security, and I might add, environmental basis, there's such a strong case for allowing U.S. export of oil. I cannot imagine why the administration does not. I yield back. Thank you.
Well said, Senator Cassidy. Senator Hirono.